So Najee, I'm going to start with you. You're an Erie-based artist, but you spend a generous portion of your time traveling for creative opportunities. In the modern digital era, do you think local artist is a term that creatives should use as a qualifier?
Well, thank you for asking that to beat that. I appreciate it. So I want to say yes and no, mostly no though. While I feel there's merit in recognizing your own roots, inspirations, and like an inherent support system based on your geographical location, to use it just strictly as like a qualitative measure of your ability to produce good content almost sounds kind of presumptuous. Like just because you're from New York doesn't inherently mean that you're going to produce, great content. But while there are many locations like New York, Chicago, LA, Tennessee, Atlanta, and that's just in the States, that are renowned for that cultural incubation. In the same breath, the residents of these cities are they're kind of responsible for showing a damaging lack of support for the artists during their most formative years. So more often than not, you'll find that the residents kind of depend on the laurels of the city and the renown of the city itself, rather than actually their own ear and supporting these individual artists. So you'll see a bunch of underground artists or a bunch of underground or up and coming visual artists or physical artists trying to bring out people and rally support. And you don't really hear it, but as soon as they kind of take off and they reach the next echelon, all of a sudden they find that there's this rally cry of, oh wow, they're from my city. And so seeing that happen often, I find that it's not really, it can be helpful to kind of have it as just another factor and asset. But overall, I don't think it needs to be a qualifier. It's just another kind of tidbit of information that helps just give some context.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. How do you refer to yourself when you're in conversation with others and you introduce yourself as an artist? How do you refer to yourself?
I simply, in this context, I refer to myself as an Erie-based artist because, most of us are Erie-based, but most of the time I end up just referring to myself as just a music artist or a creator. And with that, kind of extends the conversation and leads to the question, oh, where are you from? Where kind of are your influences from? Where do you take inspiration from? As opposed to, oh, they're from here and kind of limiting their perception of that.
Wonderful. The next question is for Jessica. A generous portion of Menagerie's clients are both regional small businesses and local nonprofits. How has budgetary constraints due to closures impacted those in the creative sector that provide business-to-business services such as yourself?
Well, initially, when everything started happening, we saw kind of a halt in business. I think primarily due to social distancing. But now that we're a few weeks into this, we started to see more people looking to produce more visual content through their marketing efforts. And so I think that as far as the creative sector goes, a lot of people are actually relying heavily on visual-based content. And so I actually see that there's actually a more need for marketing and visual material out there.
So as a creative industry that is business to business, how are you positioning yourself to adapt to that increased demand?
Well, personally, we've actually been working from home. We've had to make a lot of adjustments in how we deal with our clients, but we do live in an age where things can be accessible virtually, and I think that people are starting to look towards more episodic content, bite-sized pieces where we can produce things from home or distancing ourselves somewhat. So maybe it's not as much focused on the people, but maybe the product that they're producing. So, for example, a manufacturing client, we're able to still produce content for them and not really be interacting with that many people. So I think it's just going to change the type of content and videos that we are producing for now. But also, I think that we've also seen people reaching out to us that are looking for advice on how they can create some of their own content. And then we're able to edit that content. So I think that a lot of people are looking towards, more visual things that they can put out there, and we're there to support them through that. But I've also noticed that other people I know that are in the creative fields, whether they're graphic designers or web developers, they've actually seen increased work because people are looking, kind of halting, taking a step back, and then they're like, hey, let me get back to that website that I was looking to develop, that I put on the back burner for now. Or, hey, I really wanted to start a podcast and I never really had time. Now's a good time to start because now I have a little bit more time to focus on something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think we've seen that even within our arts organizations. I know Americans for the Arts have been conducting an ongoing survey about how both COVID-19 and social distancing have impacted nonprofit arts organizations, but also how they've responded to it. And something like, I want to say over 80 or 90% of participants have reported that they've increased their online presence during this time through social media engagement, but also updating their website, doing blog series, podcasts, et cetera. And I certainly know that's true for, not just Erie Arts and Culture, but also the Philharmonic, who we have as part of our panel this evening. Nate, my next question is for you. It's easy for us to focus on the impact that social distancing has had on the revenue streams of arts organizations, but how do you see closure of after-school arts-based programs, including the youth and family, impacting the youth and families that organizations like Erie Dance Theater serves?
Well, the COVID pandemic has definitely been a bit of a crippling event to take place for a lot of our inner city youth, considering the fact that a lot of them don't have access to computers and things of that nature to be able to go online and stream. So for that, the school district, as well as your multimedia companies, such as our cable companies, are doing as much as they possibly can to try to offset the cost to allow families to be able to have online access, to be able to finish education, and allowing the kids to be able to reach out beyond their homes in order to receive content. The other thing that we end up worrying about is, well, lack of space. The children don't necessarily have the room to be able to move the way they would like to, say if they were in the studio and whatnot. So I know that with dance theater, we have allowed students to use the facility on one-on-one basis, along with parents, to come in and use the facility to allow them to continue, stretching and dancing. And usually, most of the time, that's mostly with our older kids. The younger kids are a little bit at a disadvantage because the parents don't have the knowledge to help instruct the children as far as how to execute movements and things of that nature, and or don't have the knowledge or education to assist in corrections when kids have questions. When you're dealing with this particular type of an environment, it's new to all of us as far as what's the best source to be able to reach all of our clients and produce the product, such as dance arts, that we are involved in. And then how do you get it to all of your constituents at a rate where, well, they used to be able to pay for it, and it's kind of hard to say, well, how do you pay for it when 80% of the country is laid off? No one has any money. So you just basically try to find as much free material, if not your own, within our own studio. I know that we're doing things like that, providing classes for students online. And if there are any pending questions, usually the kids will reach out through Facebook or one of the other multimedia connections to talk to the instructors if they're having major questions, because let's face it, most of the parents are not educated in the arts, so can't really give them the proper instruction. Hopefully here within the next few weeks, we'll be coming together now that we're moved to a different phase in some way, shape, or form, if it's in a limited amount of space dealing with the kids. Classes that were large will be cut in half. Times in which working with the kids may also be cut back, but trying to allow them to be able to move in some way, shape, or form outside of their own living spaces. So that's how we're going to go about attempting to work in this unforeseen time that none of us are accustomed to.
As a follow-up to that, Nate, you touched base on equity and access to resources. What hopes do you have that conversation around equity and access will continue beyond just the current pandemic?
I think that use of a lot of our systems that we have currently in place, like for instance, public access, who has a lot of free material as far as software and hardware to allow those of us who don't have access to that on a normal basis, able to use that those resources to get our information out, get the classes out to individuals that are limited to being able to come out and still be able to take access to it. So with that being said, we are still all researching to find out what's the best form to use. I know that within the current situation that we have now, because everyone's using social media, the internet is really, really bogged down. So a lot of times the material drops out, or if it's not the video, then it's the audio. So it makes taking classes on a normal basis be very, very difficult at best. One of the things we were considering was trying to have classes outside, now that the weather's changing, in an open environment, to be able to allow students to be able to spread out and in an open environment to allow the distancing that they need to be able to stay as healthy as we possibly can.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to ask if it's possible if you can angle your camera up slightly so you're cut off from the nose up. And I was just wondering if it could be get your full frame facing. There you go. There you go. Much better. Steve, my next question's for you.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you so much, Nate. Steve, my next question's for you. 2018 and 2019 were tremendous years for the Philharmonic. The organization launched some new initiatives, reported strong attendance at live concerts, grew its endowment, and purchased its office building. 2020 then seemed to deliver a lot of disruptions, from the Warner Theater closing for renovation to events being canceled due to social distancing requirements. How big of a setback do you estimate this to be for your organization?
I think there will be some growing pains that we're surely going to take out of this. And I think all in all, it has turned out to be a little bit of a good perspective builder for us, that if you would have talked to me in January and February, the hardest problem was moving an entire audience base from the Warner Theater to the arena. We had to seat 2,000 people from scratch, and that was going to be the hardest thing on the planet. And I would take anything for those days right now, where that was the hardest thing we had to deal with. So for now, I think we're sort of looking at a few different avenues depending on what things look like in the fall. For us, because of the renovations, our season had to end early, so we only had to really cancel 2 concerts. It certainly could have been worse. And our season is slated to start in the end of September. So we have a little bit of time to sort of come up with what we're thinking are 3 potential roadmaps for the future, a lot of it depending on how many people we can get together. If I can get 60 people together only, there's a good chance that we'll end up streaming the first 4 to 5 concerts of the season. Where the worst thing to do would be to bring in only 400 people as an audience to the arena. Because even if we could spread everybody out, there's no safe way to have everybody come in the doors. You have food lines and bathroom lines. So that's a nightmare that we don't want to go through. We'd rather find a way to maybe stream a concert where we can get 60 orchestra musicians on stage at the arena spread out, and then we find a good way to stream that concert to our subscribers and ticket buyers. And then if the numbers go up or down, we're looking at potentially changing some of the music that we're playing to have a smaller group, or would we have to potentially postpone our season entirely until January? So it's forced us to really sort of embrace the concept of scenario planning, where you have 3 to 4 options that you just have ready to go and then adapt as soon as you know more information.
So building on that, if you were optimistic about one thing from the current pandemic, what is that?
I think it's our ability to do our mission regardless of a concert hall. And that's been kind of the most special thing to take out of this, with our music director, our soloists, our musicians creating content. We've been able to do the 3 central tenets of our mission statement: educate, enrich, and entertain. And we've proven that we don't necessarily need a 2,200 seat venue to do that. And that's been really special. One of the last couple things we've been working on in the last few days is we have a Grow Up Great program through PNC, and we've been recording 45-minute classroom sessions that we're going to send out starting with Deal Preschool, and then we're going to make it available to all the preschools and pre-K programs throughout the city district. And they are basically 8 45-minute complete lessons with reading activities, motion activities, singing, literacy, all of it kind of wrapped up into these really nice 45-minute lessons. So it's shown that we can definitely be creative and resilient and still keep doing our mission.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just as a note, it seems like the more folks we have log in, the more we see a little bit of a drain on our video feed. So I do apologize for the quality of the video feed that you might all be receiving. We have about 50 participants in the Zoom conversation right now, which is certainly, I think, the most I've personally had in a Zoom meeting at once, and it does seem to be putting a little bit of a pull on the bandwidth. Najee, next question is for you. In her book, Root Shock, author Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullove writes about the importance of independent creative venues, mentorship, and perspectives larger than one's immediate community. She writes, the interconnections, the young boys developing their individual virtuosity, the group establishing a common core of ideas, nurtured both by the local street scene and the national circuit, were essential to the survival and prosperity of the community. Because of the generative nature of the interconnections, those that showed true talent had many venues in which to nurture their talents. The active creative life was the result of its interior processes, artists nurtured by the collective and in turn giving expression to the people's moods, issues, and tribulations. It seems like you've been embraced more outside of Erie for your creative gifts than maybe you have been here in Erie. Why do you think we have a difficult time valuing the arts beyond a commodity, and how do you view the artist's role in society?
Well, I personally think that the commodification or the view of musicians or artists, creators in general as commodifications of society is more than just local. It's more than just national. It's a global kind of mentality that we've slowly collected thus far. But for myself, I personally believe that my role in society is as a dutiful storyteller. Musicians, artists, any sort of form of creator can provide probably some of the most accurate historic information. And when I say accurate, I mean it's an accurate representation of the zeitgeist of the time. It's an accurate representation of various classes, moods, and opinions and thoughts. And like you were saying, in her book, she expressed that once they feel that sort of overall support from the community, then they can be the voice for said community. And musicians, in my context specifically, music has been a continual voice for oppression or highlights or political standpoint, and they've always kind of been the backbone or underlying tone for major events, civil rights events, political campaigns, anything you can really think of has always incorporated some sort of creative aspect in order to kind of be the glue, if you will, to the whole thing and give people a tying element. But for some reason, that kind of gets lost, maybe because it's so familiar to people, or maybe because it might be taken for granted. The fact that we are always kind of there to provide that sense of glue, because it seems like it's a natural expression to express oneself feels like a freedom to a creator. So many people want to achieve that, and they feel like because of the stresses of society, they aren't able to kind of prioritize that or make that their mainstay because they have too many things to take care of. But I personally think that because we are so critical to kind of laying the message and the feelings and the overall mood of society at present, or in the past, that we are as important as, maybe not as directly and influentially as important as, say, like a doctor or a garbage man, and things that have to be physically taken care of. But we're a very, very high percentage of what we do and how we operate as a society, as a culture, in not just the States, but globally, it incorporates creativity, incorporates artistry. And to say that, or to view it as a commodity is kind of doing it a great disservice. So in order to come out of that, I think we have to kind of acknowledge, find ways to acknowledge that more, the importance of that, or the presentness of that glue, and how impactful our voices are, and how much of the story that we're telling has been collected from various sources. Like I said, it's not limited to just the oppression of the lower class or the comfortability of the higher class. It is an all-encompassing kind of book and an encyclopedia of experiences and cultures. So that's pretty much my take on it. I feel like if we can focus more on highlighting the fact that it is so capable of telling everybody's story, we might find more reason to highlight it as something valuable in all assets and all facets of our regular society, and what we view as important.
That's a tremendous answer. Thank you so much for that insight. I really do think that was a fantastic answer. Jessica, the next question is for you. When people think of film production, they often think of major markets such as New York or Los Angeles. Over the past decade and a half, we've seen production shift to mid-sized markets such as Pittsburgh due to the scalable costs and state-level tax incentives. How do you think this current situation will impact how people view areas of high population density as creative centers? And do you foresee that playing a role in site locations for future film productions? If yes, what does it take for smaller markets like Erie to be competitive?
I absolutely think that trend is going to continue. And I think Erie is in a good place to start to take advantage of that. I think the best place to start would be for us to create a database, which is something that the film office has been trying to do, where we can catalog and photograph our various locations and allow businesses to self-submit themselves into this database. I think that we have a lot to offer as far as even as a community of artists. Generally, big productions require, artists, craftsmen. They require people to cater the sets. I think that right now, this would be a great outlet for businesses such as restaurants who aren't able to have people come in and, eat at the restaurant, whether they could offer themselves to be, a location where people could film, or, just even to cater a production set. I think that would be, great. And like I said, the film office has been trying to put this together for a while, but right now they're pretty understaffed, underfunded. And I think that as a community, we should really start to look towards supporting that and figuring out a way that we could all create that resource, so that when production companies are looking to, for a location to film, Erie would be a great contender. And not to mention that it would also help other industries such as, hospitality. And I think that in general, Erie is very, cost effective. And I think that, right now, places like, New York and LA are still, they're in lockdown, and, production there is basically halted. And so I think that big productions are going to be starting to look towards places that are off the beaten path, so that they can just get back to work and start, producing content.
I was living in Alaska in 2012, and around that time, you started to see a lot of productions taking place in the state of Alaska, and it seemed like it was kind of this culmination between state incentives, public funding for film productions, but then also a big push from either the local chamber of commerce or the visitors bureau, either at a city level or at a state level. Do you think that type of cross-sector collaboration would be necessary to see Erie positioned as a creative hub as well?
Absolutely. I think that Erie can do a lot more to advertise what we have to offer to the film industry, not to mention individual businesses themselves. For example, hair salons, if they could start to even pivot slightly to be like, hey, I could offer hair and makeup on set, or, restaurants even individually, promoting the fact that they would be open to that would help. But absolutely, I think that we need to have a lot of collaboration if Erie as a city wants to be noticed as a possible place for film productions to take place. And yeah, Pennsylvania has a great tax incentive already if you want to film your production here. And right now, like you said, Pittsburgh definitely has capitalized on that in the last, 10 years. And that has really built up a huge, huge film industry for them, which I think that Erie is not that far away. We just need to create the resources, so that way if a production decides they do want to film here, all they have to do is, go to the film office, and on the site, it could give them all the resources that they would need to be able to put together all of the, it might not necessarily be like the crew, because they'll probably fly in, their main points, like their DP and whatever. But as far as the other parts that go into a production, I think that we have more than enough for somebody to be able to come here and put together the full production crew.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Nate, the next question is for you. As organizations pivot to include virtual programming, what are some of either the capacity constraints or technical challenges that small and mid-sized organizations face when developing and delivering content?
One of the biggest issues will be the hardware as well as software to be able to deliver the product. I know that currently I am currently searching for widescreen cameras to be able to do recordings within the studio. If you're stuck between that of a small laptop or whatnot, you're limited in space. And the further back away from the computer you get, the harder the image it is to view. However, but with better cameras as well as mics to be able to hear as well as view the artist, that's the easier it will be for your clients to be able to follow you along during the classrooms. I think that right now I'm currently searching the internet to find a more affordable software as well as hardware to supply our studios with cameras, so our instructors, in the event that we are not allowed to come back in a large setting as we were accustomed to, that we can do virtual classes within the studio and then give those out to our staff, our students, so they can continue to study from home if be, until the opportunity presents itself that we can then come together in small groups for performances, and or even doing virtual performances online to our families and merchants out there who would like to view the arts but not able to come out. I know that recently Broadway has now opened up the possibility of doing viewing online musicals and whatnot. This is something that we had hoped for years and years ago, now coming to reality. I know that I've watched a couple of various musicals that I would have loved to have gone to Broadway to see, but now had the pleasure of watching it in my living room. I think that being able to do more of those type of performances will be an eye-opening experience, even for those who who have not been able to come out and to a theater to see a live performance. It's the next best thing to gain an audience and or appreciation for the arts. And with that being said, we would also possibly be able to gain more financial support to be able to allow us to be able to do that. I know that funding is very, very difficult at this particular point in time because, well, we can't come together. However, if we're able to provide some type of entertainment to our constituents in the form of virtually presenting it online, that we would still be able to get the support to be able to do that, because we are all starving artists at the end of the day. And we all want to continue to perform to the best of our ability. I know that I can speak not only for myself, but all the other artists that I work with. We're all going a little stir crazy, having to sit at home and trying to keep ourselves busy. And we all now have a lot to say with this almost 3 months of stay-home vacation that we didn't necessarily want, as far as having material in which to create from. We are all knowing and learning more about our families, maybe more so than we wanted to. But it is a great bit of information and entertainment that we could all transform and turn into a very enlightening performance.
You know, I always like to remind folks of community access media as a really great resource when it comes to, you know, investments in software and hardware can be quite expensive, as I'm sure Jessica can attest. But we have a tremendous asset in our community with community access media, where I think their memberships range from $60 to $90 a year. And with that, you know, they've built a brand new studio with an infinity wall. They have 4K cameras, a brand new audio engineering lab, a podcasting lab, as well as really great video editing software. I'm not sure if Jacob's tuned in tonight. If he is, perhaps when it comes time to the Q&A portion at the end, he can type in the chat function what their open hours are or accessibility is during this current time. I'm not sure how much they're functioning right now. But under normal circumstances, community access media, I can't tout them enough as a tremendous resource for our community. Likewise, Penn State Behrend has the equipment lending program as well. And then maybe, Jessica, when we come back around to you for your question, if you have any thoughts on, you know, affordable equipment or ways to access equipment without huge capital investments, maybe you can chime in on that. So the next question is for Steve. You know, the other year, the Erie Philharmonic partnered with Whitethorn Digital to create the Virtual Philharmonic, a mobile arts and education tool. Arts organizations across the world are having to re-examine traditional models of delivering programs and service. Innovation and collaboration are words that sometimes feel like buzzwords, but what do those terms look like when implemented in the arts, and what role do you see them playing here in our region?
I think for us, and I can probably speak for Kate over at the Playhouse, those two words are going to become equal tenets like the other parts of our mission statement. Like, we are going to have to be innovative and creative to find a way to get through sort of a lack of being able to deliver our normal concerts. So that's sort of what we're looking at now, is we're finding almost a lack of the appropriate resources to do what we need to do. We've managed to partner up with WQLN, and they have the cameras ready to go, so we can do a concert at the arena, and we've already secured with QLN a way to have 4 cameras there to stream a concert. So we have a way to do kind of the hardest things. We have the product, we have the musicians, and we have the technology. The trick is, when the cameras are done and we have this product, there is not necessarily a good mechanism for us to get it to people in a way that makes sense. So we've started looking out to some existing tech providers, like a software like Vimeo, where we could set up and stream directly to Vimeo, but that ends up being a $30,000 price tag annually just to be able to do that, because we need to set up a way to have a paywall that if you buy a ticket, you have to be able to log in. So in us doing probably 2 to 3 weeks of research so far, there's literally nothing that works well on every aspect of it. So then you have to start to figure out, where is it okay to make compromises, or where do we have to get innovative and almost invent our own way to do it? And that's kind of where we're sort of right in the middle now. We have a couple more calls lined up to talk to a couple more providers. And then we're just going to start getting creative ourselves. And if we record a concert, how can we actually get it out to people in a way with a paywall that they can buy a ticket and see this performance? So it's sort of showcasing a lack of, because no one ever had to do it, no one ever invented it, and now we're sort of left with the way to do it.
You've got sirens and cats all around you, Steve. Given both Nate's response and Steve's response, I'm actually going to jump directly to Jessica with this question, because I think it feeds into both of the previous 2 responses. As presenters and producers of live events pivot and adapt to virtual programming, what recommendations do you make for choosing the right platform for delivering content, whether that be Zoom, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok? And when do you recommend live streaming over pre-recording and editing? And additionally, while we're on that topic, you know, how we can approach access to resources like equipment without huge capital investments.
Well, as far as Erie goes, I think Erie is still heavily a Facebook market. I think the future of that is pivoting, you know, towards Instagram and, you know, and TikTok and things like that. But I think that primarily right now, Erie is still, that's where you're going to reach your largest audience on Facebook. As far as, you know, streaming something live versus, you know, pre-recording it and editing it together, I think that really depends on the amount of crowd interaction that you need. So, for example, you know, I've seen a lot of local musicians streaming, you know, concerts live, but then they have the option of a tip jar so people can, you know, donate, you know, money to them. Or if somebody's doing a fundraising effort and, you know, they're looking at getting people to interact with that, live streaming is a good way to do that. Another would be, you know, something like this, a panel discussion or a debate where, you know, there's a Q&A section, or, you know, you're looking to have people submit responses to. But as far as some larger events like theatrical productions and honestly even the Philharmonic, I think that there is something to be said about that being live, like the sense of the camaraderie of a crowd. But if the crowd can't really interact necessarily, I don't necessarily see a benefit in streaming it live. I think that you could still get the same effect and honestly, you know, a better production value by recording it, you know, separately and editing it together, and, you know, even allowing, you know, cameras to be on stage and actually getting more of that produced effect. And as far as things, I saw Matt put into the chat as far as renting equipment locally, the Greater Erie Arts Rental at Penn State Barron does have an arsenal of equipment there that is relatively affordable to rent. That's some of their stuff is a little bit more higher end, so that's not something that necessarily everybody would be looking to rent for, you know, what they're trying to put together. But right now, I mean, honestly, you know, production equipment is relatively inexpensive, and I think that you know, even it's amazing like what, you know, your phone can do. And for something like, you know, the Philharmonic and even theatrical productions, I think that there's actually more of an emphasis on audio capture than even with the video side of it. And I think that just by having good audio, you're actually going to level up the production that way. But yeah, I think that as far as, I don't see that there's necessarily a disadvantage of pre-recording a show and then finding a way to monetize it that way. And I think that, like I said, you can actually get more creative with the production and allow for more of a more experiential video that way as well, just by getting creative with camera angles and things like that.
Talking about monetization of the arts, it doesn't seem like a lot of artists in Erie, whether they're performing based or visual based, are necessarily exploring avenues like Patreon. What are your thoughts on using platforms like Patreon to build out a tiered structure for mobilization and patron support?
I think that's a good way to go. I mean, I think that people that are looking to support the arts are going to do it no matter what. And so something like Patreon allows you to put it onto one platform and can even allow for a subscription type of monetization. For example, one of our employees, Greg Happ, has a web series that he produced called Food Unchained, and him and a couple of his friends went around and created this series showcasing local restaurants, and they created a Patreon account to allow people to just help support that, and I felt like that was a great way for them to, you know, allow their audience to get engaged with that and feel like they're supporting them when you know, they're not, they're kind of doing it on a shoestring budget. And so I think that right now, more than ever, arts organizations should always sort of have this open kind of fundraising effort and making it easily accessible for people to want to support them. So that way, you know, when this is over, we still have, you know, things to come back to when this is all said and done.
Thank you for that. Naji, the next question is for you. As we look to recover from setbacks incurred as a result of social distancing and the pandemic, it would be a missed opportunity if planning didn't center equity and inclusion as non-negotiable priorities. You're young, talented, engaging, and have a growth-oriented mindset, which, if you ask me, is the type of individual that Erie needs to both retain and attract. What has been your experience to date navigating Erie's cultural and creative sector as an artist of color, and what are some of the areas of inequity that you feel are primed to be addressed as we move forward as a community?
So I was mainly got involved with the creative sector of the Erie when I started high school. So I moved here with my family in 2010, and at the time I was a junior in high school, and I was coming from being cyber schooled and homeschooled and based in southeast Pennsylvania, so in Chester County, Lancaster County, you know, Amish country. So when I was coming here, coming from a kind of, it definitely wasn't isolated at all. You know, the benefit of being homeschooled was, yes, I had a lot of individual time, but there was an extensive homeschool community. So actively doing museum events, trips, connecting with other homeschoolers in the area, that kind of thing. But coming out from that kind of very, very customized, specific, and tailored schooling experience into the public experience was, you know, kind of an adjustment in and of itself. But specifically to Erie, one of the key things that I noticed was the surprising amount of it's not necessarily, it's still not segregation, but the fact that so many people of color specifically were so limited in their access to creative programs, and the access that they did have were usually very limited in funding and very limited in spacing, and kind of structured around whatever was just left over from the annual budget for those kinds of things. So when I was coming into it, coming as a percussionist, I kind of started touring the jazz circuit, the honors jazz circuit, and moving up into the regional competitions, that kind of thing, and started in that space, and started just as a strictly performing musician. So in that space, I noticed that there was, once you were kind of within the circuit, it was relatively easy to navigate, but actually getting into that circuit was the difficult part. And the reason why I was even able to get into that circuit was through various efforts from gracious teachers. So when I was I graduated from McDowell, and the only reason I was able to still attend McDowell was actually due to the efforts of Stephanie Williams, Dr. Stephanie Williams, who was the vice principal at the time. I'm not sure if she's still there or not, but at the vice principal at the time of the school, and Mr. Brett Johnson, and the superintendent of Mill Creek. All of them kind of combined their efforts in order to keep me within the Mill Creek School District, and provide the percussionary support and the musical support for their programs, just because I showed enough talent to be able to do so. But the thing is that talent was able to be nurtured because I, prior to entering Erie, had spent extensive time providing myself that space and being in an area where I was able to hone those crafts, or hone those skills and develop those crafts. Whereas many of my peers or many of my kids my age weren't fortunate enough to be able to, even just have that time to themselves. Too many external circumstances would prevent them from being able to focus on that. If they were looking to just figure out where their family's going to eat the next month. Not that I didn't have those very same stressors, but I was fortunate enough in that the locations that I happened to live in and the situations that I had set up were very conducive to being able to just kind of hone in and focus on that. But many people of color do not have that same opportunity or situation. And that is unfortunately very prevalent for the people of color specifically, especially when we look at like East School District, and the consolidation even of many of Erie's school districts into singular buildings. It's kind of exacerbated that problem. So for me, the biggest difficulty was really seeing how to be able to get, like, I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of get to the other side and start within that circuit and spread my wings, so to speak, and start connecting with the professors and the academia, anybody involved in that sector, and just being able to, because I had the backing of Mr. Brent and Dr. Stephanie Williams, there was a lot less that needed to be said or proven, I guess tacitly. Whereas I could, somebody of a similar stature without any of that prior backing or support might have an incredibly difficult time getting to the same place that I did. And it's unfortunate that I needed the help of, the highest, I guess, what's the word I think? The highest authority, local authority, as far as the school district goes, to be able to even just graduate, and succeed as a musician. So I feel like there's a lot of work to do to be able to provide just even basic resources for many people of color, to be able to just have a basal operational support, just for basic living, and then that was pre-COVID. That was before anything even happened in the situation. Now we're getting into a situation where everybody's kind of starting to experience that to a degree, but it's kind of eye-opening to see how quickly people of color are able to adapt to this type of situation, because unfortunately we're very used to being in a survival headspace and being in a kind of standstill and not knowing when we're going to eat, not knowing who is going to be harming us, or how many unknowns. So this is not necessarily entirely new territory. The pandemic is, but the concept of being unsure of what's going to happen or where our resources are going to be going to is not an unknown concept to us. So I think that a lot of the groundwork has to be in really bringing up every level of the city to just a basal operation of just wellness before we can get to the point where we can talk about extending, certain programs. That's just kind of like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. If you throw more money at it, everything's fine. But that's not necessarily the case. There are a lot of underground layers that have to be kind of peeled back and analyzed and mediated first before we can get to just funding. But funding, it's good to know that I heard there was community access television at Penn State there and other rental programs and things like that. So the funding does exist, but it's the allocation of that funding that is tricky, and that's kind of a challenge for not just people of government, but everybody in general. So for me, I feel that if we can provide more access or more awareness of access to that form of funding or to those higher end venues like colleges, museums, hotels, parks, to all the districts and provide the same kind of championing that I received when I was in high school and apply that to all students of all creeds, colors, races, I feel like we would have a lot more appreciation for the arts and a lot more capability and flexibility and reachability as the arts. But I'm not sure exactly how to approach that or who to approach that with, but that's my thinking on it. My experiences led me to believe that there are a lot of just basal challenges that we have to work through first before we can get to then just funding and then get providing the funding.
Building upon that, my next question is going to be for Nate. Historically, arts organizations across the nation have centered whiteness. The art that has been presented is primarily male-made and reflective of European heritage. Erie's urban core is where many of our arts organizations are located. The core is also where we see our most diverse population demographics. What do you envision when you imagine a diverse and robust cultural and creative sector?
A reflection of our entire society. For one, it's not just a black thing or a white thing. All of us as Americans are basically a melting pot of all walks of this great country we happen to live in. European, Asian, African, etc., etc. So with that being said, we have to be reflective and also remember that whom we're talking to, it's not just about ourselves. Yes, it's a great art. It's one of the lovely things about art is we're able to touch on very questionable subjects with a little bit more of ease because, well, we're not bound by the freedom of speech. We can use music, you can use dance, you can use literature as far as theater to express very, very touchy subjects that normally may be very controversial, but able to attract the eye of an individual who may not be Black, who may not be Hispanic, who may not be Asian, who may not even be white, and be able to touch their soul with something that may have affected you or a view that they may have not looked at, or it's like this. Regardless as to who you happen to be, you'll never walk in my shoes. I can take you on a journey when I perform, as it were, from my perspective, to give you a little bit of an insight of what it's like, but you will never walk in my shoes. Now, with that being said, that then opens your eyes to see just what it's like, basically looking from stage as what it might be like. And that's the entertaining factor of it, why we keep going back, because it's a story that we're not used to. We didn't see it. We didn't walk that way. We didn't talk that way. We didn't dress that way. And you get to see it from a different perspective. And you don't have to worry about changing who you are as a person, how you look, or how you dress. You can still dress the same, look the same, walk the same, but you can then see and then gain a little bit more appreciation to someone different than yourself, not just taking someone from a face value or looking at their sexual preference, their ethnic background, their socioeconomic status, or anything of that nature, but just appreciating the human factor of that individual. And with that being said, that's where we, as myself as an artist, when I go to approach a piece, who am I talking to? I happen to be Black, but am I just speaking to a Black audience? No, I'm speaking to my community, the American people, or anybody who would want to sit down and be entertained through the art of dance, from my perspective. And that's how I look at it. I'm sure the other artists that are in this panel do a very similar process, following the educational process that they've studied to bring them to the artistry that they're currently working in. However, it all starts somewhere, and we all came to this country with something to say. And that's what makes it so wonderful and diverse.
Thank you for that, Nate. Najee, I saw you preparing to respond.
You're welcome.
Would you like to weigh in on that at all?
I mean, I agree with pretty much everything he said. You know, for me, it's diversity is not just saying, you know, we have a brown guy, a Black guy, and a yellow guy, and a red guy. Like it's and it's not being colorblind either. It's not acknowledging those differences, but simply just enjoying and appreciating the art, or whatever the case would be, the diverse experience that someone might provide, and celebrating that. You know, that for me, that is what I envision a diverse experience to be, whether it's male, female, as he said, sexuality. That is, personally, it's not irrelevant, but it is not a determining factor in whether or not that experience is valid or not. All experiences and all types are valid.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Steve, next question goes to you. There is no playbook for what we are experiencing in the present moment. It is is it time to play it safe, or is it time to take some risks? What is your litmus test for exploring new ideas and programs?
I mean, we were always one that would have a t-shirt that said our motto is, it's always better to ask forgiveness than permission. And that was how we approached things before a pandemic. So I think at this point, we've shown that this is definitely not the time to necessarily play it safe, in the sense that we can't just bury our heads in the sand and hope that, no, by the time we hit fall, everything's going to be totally fine and we don't need to re-envision what we do. If we do that, if we choose to sit back and be like, I don't want to think about anything that is different than what we're normally doing, I really don't think there's a chance that we'd be able to survive pretty much as an orchestral art form across the country. I think some of the bigger orchestras that have had resources to already have online streaming content are potentially a step ahead of us, which is why we're definitely being aggressive in the avenues that we're looking at for doing concerts. And I think that's sort of gauging how we look at the audience participation for the first couple concerts of the season. That is it riskier to stream a concert to try to get 2,000-3,000 people, or do a live concert for only 400? What serves the audience better? What serves the musicians better? So it sort of opens up our ways to think about things. But for sure, I think this is definitely the time to, again, I'd say take the necessary risks. One of the other quotes I had just seen earlier today in one of the billions of seminars we've been doing about, again, planning for all of this, is it's better to be vaguely right than exactly wrong. And it's sort of an interesting way to look at how we're looking at the future. We don't necessarily know how we're going to modify our programming to be online or virtual if necessary, but I know not looking at that is the only thing we can't do. And I think some of the risks and things that we're looking at taking will turn into future endeavors that we'll keep doing forever. If we can have virtual classrooms set up that we have to create now, these could turn into virtual lessons that could exist for the next 10 to 20 years for the orchestra, where we have a room set up that you walk in this room, there's a TV monitor and a camera and a microphone ready to go, and our musician could give a lesson to anybody across the city or the state, depending on, as long as they have access to the internet. So I think it's going to let us create new mechanisms going forward that'll benefit the orchestra for leaps and bounds. And maybe none of them would have come about if we weren't put in a position like this, where pretty much everything we do is risky. The only thing you can't do is nothing. So each of these things end up being risks in their own right.
Building upon that then, how have you seen your audiences expand to include individuals from outside of Erie? And additionally, what possibilities do you see for connecting to new audiences that may not live in Northwestern Pennsylvania?
I mean, we can definitely tell from the online material that we've been doing that it's being sort of eaten up, and not just from our local audiences. Our Facebook page is very much regional. And as Jessica said, Facebook is definitely Erie's mechanism to sort of digest content. And we've really noticed that we did our first live recital last night, and it's already been viewed about 1,500 times just over the course of from broadcasting yesterday to today. And we know that's not just an Erie market. So that, I think, is sort of giving us access to a regional audience that we maybe never did on this concurrent of a basis. We've noticed that we've been able to send out more emails and consistent communications than we ever have before. And we rarely ever get anybody saying like, hey, you're sending us too much stuff. If anything, we'll get people that respond to what is clearly an automated email with new videos, a new playlist, a new story, and people are taking the time to respond to those like, oh my God, thank you so much for these coloring pages and these activities. I printed these and took these into for my elementary students to use online this week. So without this pandemic, we never would have had the ability to sort of create those things. It's sort of things we've always wanted to do, but this has sort of forced it. And then we look at the QLN radio broadcast we've been able to do. All of our musicians are unionized. They have a CBA. They're part of the AFM, the American Federation of Musicians. So it's always been very tricky for us to be able to get broadcasts on WQLN because there are very appropriate things in place. As a previous musician with the orchestra, there are things in place to make sure that the musicians are compensated. But because there's been no concerts to speak of, the musicians have given us the permission to broadcast concerts on WQLN. And that's why we've been able to do that. We've been trying to do that for 5 to 6 years, and there's never been a good way to do it. And it's been fascinating to see those radio programs. And that's reaching probably 5,000 to 6,000 people on a Friday morning that we never would have normally reached on a random Friday at 10 a.m.
So the title of this panel discussion is where do we go from here? So my last question to each of the panelists, we'll start with Najee, then we'll go to Jessica, then Nate, and we'll end with you, Steve, before we go to audience questions. Where do we go from here? Najee?
I think we're definitely all going to have to be switching and getting comfortable to more virtual environments. Things like Zoom are a huge add for the kind of shift in societal function. But aside from the practicality aspect, I think where we go from here is really just taking the time to kind of build from the ground up. A lot of us are kind of focused on getting back to where we were or where things were. But it is clearly not going to be going back in that direction. So it's more kind of just reprioritizing, reshifting, and reanalyzing what the situation is and building with that in mind, as opposed to trying to return to some sort of former glory. Because this is a unique opportunity in that it's horrible that we are in the pandemic, but we have a unique opportunity to really build out proper support for everything from the ground up, essentially. So it's a really opportune space to be in as far as what we allocate resources to, rules, regulations, how we kind of dictate where funds go. Everything is kind of up in the air right now. So it's a really good chance to have those discussions. There's really nothing else to do at present except have those discussions and move forward.
Jessica, where do we go from here?
Well, I think that the resounding common theme is that people are getting to experience things that they didn't have time to do before and may not have even thought to give a try. And so I think from here, we should all take some of the things that we have learned during this time that we've been given to adapt and take those things and move forward with them, and integrate them in how we're going to move forward. And so I don't think that it's necessarily going to be like, hey, we have to like start from scratch, build everything over again. But I do think that there's things to be learned from this time. And I think ultimately it's going to evolve the way that we all do business and operate our organizations.
Nate, where do we go from here?
Virtual classes will be the thing of the future. Using live performances in the sense of pre-recorded and sending them out on, if it be Facebook or whatever other live streaming of the opportunity is available to us, will probably be the thing of the future. Yes, our audiences will increase. There will not be the person-to-person interaction as far as the artist able to really feel what the audience is feeling and being able to use that as a meter to either push harder or back off. We have to basically use our own artistic integrity to decide as far as what they really want or when we should pull back. I think that by doing nothing offers a disservice to the arts. We've never in the history of the arts backed down to anything. We've always rose to the occasion, and we are the entertainment of the world. So let's not stop. Let's just keep going. Yes, it's a bump in the road. It makes it a little bit uncomfortable, but it isn't anything that we cannot prevail from and keep moving. So bring on the virtual reality. VR is interesting to me. We watch it on sci-fi. I've always wondered what it would be like to dance in a virtual world. Let's make it a reality. I've never seen a West Side Story done virtually, but I bet it would be really incredible to do.
I would like to remind folks we do have at least two companies that I'm aware of here in Erie that do program for virtual reality and augmented reality. That being Whitethorn Digital, who we mentioned the Philharmonic worked with before, as well as Imagination Park and Imagination AR, who Erie Arts and Culture has worked with on some augmented reality resources. We do have those capabilities that exist here within our community, and I would encourage artists and arts organizations to reach out to those organizations and think about how those technologies can be applied to what they produce and present. Steve, where do we go from here?
So I have to admit the timing of me reading the Steve Jobs biography right now isn't lost on me with the irony of it. I think the thing that I take out of that to compare is that we need to all get good at inventing the thing that nobody knew they needed. And that's sort of where we are with all the programming that we're doing. As we've been putting it out and doing it, it has been digested at a level we never thought possible. So I think it's sort of taking that learning process out of this to keep implementing and augmenting everything that we do going forward. How can we always think like we are now, but not having to have the pandemic as the ictus to do it? It's forcing us to be more creative than we ever have before. How can we have that spark on just a random Tuesday afternoon? So that's what we're going to keep out of it, is sort of the creative thinking that it's sort of doing things that we didn't think people would need, and they do.
Wonderful. I'm now going to open it up to audience questions. If you have a question, if you could please type it through the chat function, that would be fantastic. One question was, will this be recorded? Yes, we are recording it. We will be posting it on our blog at erieartsandculture.org probably later in this week, but the entire video will be available for viewing through that. I don't see any other questions in the present moment. If anybody has a question for our panel that they would like to type into the chat function, or if we can do it in a bit of an organized function. If you do have a question and you want to unmute your mic and ask it directly to the panel, feel free to do that now. Well, it doesn't seem like we necessarily have any questions, which either means we did a really good job of discussing things, or we'll have to go back to the drawing board for the next one. As I mentioned earlier, as we started this conversation, I really hope this is just the start of these types of conversations and not just the one and only time that these types of panel conversations and convenings occur. Last year, around the same time, actually, Erie Arts and Culture hosted a town hall where we talked about what do the arts look like presently in Erie and what would we like them to look like in Erie. And I think we had, on a Friday night, we had over 100 individuals show up and participate in that conversation. And even though we're not at a point where we can come together as a group and have those town hall style conversations, I think the pathway forward is through open dialogue. It is through transparency. It is through collaboration. And I'll say interdisciplinary and intersectional collaboration. And it's through innovation. As a reminder to everybody, we did have some resources that we discussed during this panel conversation. One is community access media. The other is the film equipment rentals at Penn State Barron. We also mentioned Whitethorn Digital and their ability to create virtual reality content, as well as Imagination Park and Imagination AR with their ability to create augmented reality content. Najee is with Thousand Stories. Nate Johnson is with Erie Dance Theater. Jessica Taylor is with Menagerie Studios. Steve Weiser is with Erie Philharmonic. It does look like we have a question that has just come up from Tisha Nesbitt. 6 months from now, what will be the sustaining expression of your creative resilience, that your creative resilience will make this a movement and not a moment? So how do we make creative resilience a movement, not a moment? I didn't see that directed to any one panelist, so I'm wondering if anyone on the panel would like to specifically respond to that.
So just trying to just repeat it back to myself. So 6 months from now, what would be the sustaining expression of our collective creative resilience that will make this a movement? And when you say this, Tesha, are you referring to these meetings, or are you referring to this kind of gathering together, or what exactly is the reference? I'm going to be assuming, for the sake of the question, it's these kind of open dialogues. And for me, I think the motivational factor is that, like I said, this is an opportunity to really kind of find a new avenue to do things right. Or, you know, as Stephen was saying, this is the most creative inducing time. And hopefully kind of just the momentum from continually having to solve problems will kind of carry us throughout the next phase, and encourage us to solve more problems, or you know, kind of come up with new ideas as we come out of this. You know, once we're at a stable point, so to speak, who's to say we don't start solving other problems that we didn't know really exist, or you know, creating new ways to extend our reach beyond just the states or our local areas, or universally even. You know, like, our minds are kind of going to be in a malleable space, hopefully, you know, by the time we come out of this, because we'll be so used to having to create those resolutions that it's just kind of the next step. It's just continuing to do so.
Anyone else want to respond to Tisha's question?
You know, I'll piggyback on that a little bit, and just the same idea that we're being more creative now. And I think the resilience that all the different artists are showing is that's what I think we have to be able to take forward. Is for us, when we go back to having normal concerts at the Warner Theater, I still want to have this same sort of relentless drive to put out content that's different than just the normal concert you can experience. So we can have our traditional concert audience. You can buy a ticket, come to the Warner, see a big movie concert or see a big Beethoven symphony. But the new avenue of people that we're reaching with the radio broadcast and the online things and all of the other content we're creating, I want to keep and grow that audience as well. I don't think it needs to be sort of an or. I think it can be an and discussion that we can sort of keep both things going.
So Mike asked if there was any input from the visual arts community. Obviously, this first conversation has been heavily focused on the performing arts here in Erie. We will be scheduling a next installment of Where Do We Go From Here that will focus more on the visual arts. So it's not anything that we're overlooking, but we wanted to concentrate this first one on the performing arts because I think often the performing arts kind of take a back seat sometimes to the visual arts. So this first conversation really focused heavily on the performing arts. The next installment of Where Do We Go From Here will focus more on the visual arts. And then I'd like to do a third installment that looks at the literary arts. Matt Levy did ask a question. He's directed it to either Steve or Nate or both. The prevailing wisdom for arts nonprofits is that if you execute innovative and exciting mission-driven programs, revenue follows. Has the current crisis shaken your faith in that principle?
I'll hop in first. It really kind of tacks on to something I heard earlier today in another one of the big consultant things we were in. The League of American Orchestras made their entire conference free online for everybody for 4 weeks. So every single day of the week, you can sort of have your head buried in constituency meetings and problem solving ideas. But one of the things that was brought up today, and it ties right into this, is instead of like, as we're planning for the future and figuring out what our sort of scenario planning is going to be, you need to have a plan that even during this crisis, the plan still needs to be focused on a goal, on a mission, on something. The only thing it can't be, your only goal cannot be surviving. If that's the only thing you're looking to do through this, you're either not going to make it or you're going to end up sort of falling behind. And that was sort of echoed by a lot of different people on that panel, that the goal still has to be part of your mission. It has to be, for us, the 3 words: educate, entertain, enrich. And whether we're in a concert hall, in a church, in an arena, or in a classroom through a YouTube camera and an iPhone, we're still going to do the 3 tenets of our mission. It's going to be harder and a little more complicated, but sticking to that drive has already proven, with some of the feedback we've received from community supporters, that has already shown it's sort of to be worth its weight in gold. And we're choosing that over just thinking that, all right, for the next 6 months, we're only thinking about survival. We definitely have to look beyond that.
As a nonprofit organization that Erie Dance Theater is under the Martin Luther King Center, our goal still doesn't change to provide quality instruction to individuals, no matter what their economic or social status happens to be. And we will continue to do so, as Erie Dance Theater's motto is to provide quality instructions, no boundaries, where dance has no boundaries. So with that being said, yes, we're going to continue doing this today, as in 6 months, as in 6 years. It's going to continue well even after I'm gone. The dance will never go away, and the arts will never stop. As long as there's a heartbeat in a chest, the arts will never ever stop, because it's the voice of the people. And with that being said, this is only given us an opportunity to broaden to a wider stage. We're so used to the black box. The black box now has been put over the internet and spread to door in everyone's living room, or cell phones, or wherever they can link up. So with that being said, I just look at it as a greater opportunity to gain a wider audience. And with that being said, yes, a little bit of a challenge, but one that I'm willing to embrace, I'm sure, as the rest of my panelists are as well.
Thank you, Nate. Is there any other questions from those in the audience that you'd like to ask to our panelists this evening? So just to reiterate, this first iteration of where do we go from here has focused more on the performing arts, but we will be focused on the visual arts as well as the literary arts in future iterations of this. And as Tisha had touched point on in her question, let's not make this a moment, let's make this a movement. Let's be intentional in how we move forward during this pandemic and after this pandemic. Because the arts are an incredibly valuable asset in our region. We know that they serve personal development, community development, and economic development. And let's make sure that we provide as broad of access to the arts as possible, and that we are very intentional in how we serve a broad audience. So again, I want to thank Najee, I want to thank Nate, I want to thank Jessica, and I want to thank Steve. I also want to thank everybody that tuned in this evening for this panel conversation. If there are no further questions, let's call it an evening. Thanks, everybody.